the two truths. The thing about the relative and the absolute is that they're there to help us figure out. I think when it's coming to me that it's there to help us figure out when we're confused about life. Right? How is it that my experience makes sense? Or how is it that my suffering, how can I have relief from the suffering? So they're essentially all Buddhism is all the lists, all the ways to me is talking about how do you get relief from your suffering. And so this is one way to frame relief from your suffering is when is it that you're stuck in the finite, and very specifically in this book, in this chapter, you'll get that's very specific of the finite, of the relative. And then when is it that our ideals, that's another word I would say for absolute, or as I made it up last week, I think, and Keiryū was pointing to, is the relative of the absolute. Right? When we have a sense of the absolute on a certain level, it's how we interpret our sense of the absolute is the relative absolute. Like love isn't, I would say love is an absolute. Technically, I think in Buddhism, technically there's only one absolute space that's considered an absolute. Everything else is relative. Perhaps in part because it's hard to be too specific about space. Because when we talk about space, we're only talking about it, the space compared to that space, or the container of space, the universe as a space. And yet it's all pervasive and it's hard to kind of pinpoint it down. It's beyond knowledge. But time is not. How we think of time, I think, can be it's all relative. So, the way to see it is when do we get stuck in the relative? What aspects? Essentially, to me, most of this chapter is about what kind of relatives do we get stuck in because we solidify it and hold on to it as absolutes when they're really relative. For instance, let's go right to, I'm going to skip. Let's go to, I have a list of them. Oh yes, page 126, if you have the book, if it's, I know it's not page number in the thing, so it would be the section that starts, I'll say, this morning. Sometimes Peter's pretty fast at finding it. This morning, in the book it would be 126. This morning before giving a Dharma talk, I was having breakfast with my attendant, a lovely novice monk. I paused and said to him, "Dear one, do you see the cow on the hillside? She is eating grass in order to make my yogurt, and I am now eating the yogurt to make a Dharma talk. Somehow the cow will offer today's Dharma talk. As I drank the cow's milk, I was a child of the cow. The Buddha recommends we live our daily life in this way, seeing everything in the light of interbeing. Then we will not be caught in our small self. We will see our joy and our suffering everywhere. We will be free, and we won't see dying as a problem. Why should we say that dying is suffering? We continue with the next generation. What is essential is to be our best while we are here. Then we continue to be through our children and grandchildren. Motivated by love, we invest ourselves in the next generation. Whether birth and death are suffering depends on our insight. With insight, we look at all these things and smile at them. They are not affected in the same way anymore. We are not affected. We ride on the wave of birth and death, and we are free from birth and death. This insight liberates us. All formations are impermanent. This sheet of paper is a physical formation formed by many elements. A rose, a mountain, and clouds are formations. Your anger is a mental formation. Your love and the ideas of non-self are mental formations. My fingers and liver are physiological formations. So when we have a sense of self, and we think of it as finite, then that's a form of relative. When we think of ourselves as interbeing or inter-are or made of compounds, then that's a form of seeing it not as relative. Would we say it was an absolute? Perhaps. So that's one. When you see the self as solid, then that's a form of relative. That's easy. Okay? So how can we break ourselves from that? Is to see that things are made of compounds. Okay? Or they're inter-are. All right. Next, look into the self and discover that it's made of non-self elements. The other version is, there's a drawing, like, here's me, I drink the milk of the cow. That becomes, so this leads to this leads to that, and we inter-are. This one is the stuff that's not about me is also part of me. So thinking of self as non-self elements. A human being is made up of only non-self element. He's stating it as an absolute. To protect humans, we have to protect the non-human elements, the air, the water, the forest, the river, the mountains, and the animals. The Diamond Sutra, the most ancient text about how to respect all forms of life on earth, animals, vegetation, and also minerals. We have to remove the notion of human as something that can survive by itself alone. Here's a good one around this whole climate crisis and the earth. Third, next page. When we look deeply into living beings, we find that they are made up of non-living being elements. Those so-called inanimate things are alive also. Our notion about living beings and inanimate things should be removed for us to touch reality. So it's not just non-self stuff, but that inanimate things are also part of reality. That's why Dogen says, earth, trees, walls, tiles, and pebbles all have a life of their own. Right? Everything has an existence that we don't understand, that we might not. Right? It's a little bit like or what's coming up for me is when I only think a bell is a bell for me to ring. That the bell, and that's true. I go through my day. Do I notice the bell? No. When do I notice the bell? When I ring it. Then it's a bell to me. And yet, the bell, is it always a bell? No. But it has a life of its own. It has an existence of its own. Does that make sense? And we sometimes forget that, and we only think inanimate things serve us. So notice this is about how we relate. It's really about how we relate. Right? We relate to ourselves as solid and separate from others. We relate to ourselves as just, it's about me, or it's not about me, or I relate to objects as serving me. This is how I go about my life for the most part. So how do I expand the sense of that it's just about me and relative to me? All right. I have 3. Oh, here's 4. The fourth notion to be removed is lifespan. We think that we exist only from this point in time until this point in time, and we suffer because of that notion. If we look deeply, we will know that we have never been born and we will never die. A wave is born and dies, is higher and lower, more or less beautiful. But you cannot apply these notions to water. When we see this, our fear will suddenly vanish. Within us, we carry the world of no birth and no death, and we never touch it because we live only with our notions. The practice is to remove these notions and touch the ultimate dimension, nirvana, God, the world of no birth and no death. Because of the notion we carry, we are unable to touch it, and we live in constant fear and suffering. When the wave lives her life as a wave deeply, she touches the dimension of water that is within her, and suddenly her fears and notions vanish, and she is truly happy. Before that, her happiness was just a kind of band-aid. The greatest relief is to touch nirvana, the world of no birth and no death. Certainly we can suffer, or I know I can suffer, by thinking, oh, does my life have meaning? Like, what is my life going to be about, you know? And that's not, by that I don't mean we shouldn't have those kind of questions or that they're bad to have, but it's a very finite way, right? It's living from here, and what do I determine is my life? It's like I don't know, the analogy that's coming up is I came out as a lesbian when I was 19 or 20 in 1980. Can't remember the date. In the 80s sometime. I can't do the math right now. It makes me 19 or I was born in 1964. Who can do the math fast? Okay, so like 70, 83 or 82 or something like that, right? So, and I actually coming out was no big deal to me. I mean, I had like 6 months where I was like, oh, maybe I'm bi, but like I realized I really loved my best friend as more than just, friendly, and that's why I was like, oh, okay, well then I'm a lesbian, I guess. And I had good lesbian role models around me at that point, so it wasn't such a shift for me. And I was, like coming out was not a problem for me. So then I was, just myself, lesbian, blah, blah, blah. And I had some friends. And then in the dorm, I had transferred to Oregon, University of Oregon, and I lived in the dorms first. And then we had moved out and, we were living in apartments. And then there were these 2 women who were friends of mine, and I just visited them a lot. And then one day, one of them wanted to tell me that she was a lesbian, right? And she said, what has really helped me is that you have been such a lesbian. like the way you are a lesbian was what really helped me learn to be a lesbian. And I said, well, what does that mean? She said, I don't know, you're just so comfortable with being a lesbian. And so when you think about it, like when you hear stories like that, and you realize, oh, I mean, when I think about that's what came up as, oh, okay, then my life, that's a kind of meaning that my life has. But when I just keep thinking, what does my life, again, I don't think it's a bad thing to think, oh, what kind of meaning do I want to have in my life? How do I want my life to be? what do I, you know, for some people that's a huge thing. I know some friends who are like, my legacy is, you know, and that's important to them. And I don't quite have that, and occasionally I certainly think, oh, well, what is the meaning of my life, right? And yet when you open it up and you think, oh, when you open up to what is the impact you've had, or what is it that how others have impacted you, how we have been together, then I don't know, is that a relative or an absolute? I really honestly don't know, except for it is to me certainly a certain kind of conversation or a certain kind of interaction about seeing my life as a finite and experiencing or being open, maybe that's the key, being open that my life has much more meaning than I'm aware of. And that's huge, to live realizing that, oh, how you are, others will notice. Do you know? I mean, I'm really glad that it was somebody like, oh, the way you're a lesbian and so open about it helped me. You know, I much prefer that someone's like, oh my God, you were so closeted and made it really hard, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's my interpretation. By that, I'm not dissing people who, you know, that being in the closet works for them. So maybe what I want to say about that also is that it's useful to remember when you feel that your life is limited, right? That's when relativity really gets you into a suffering bind. Doesn't mean that you should let go, you know, like a death of someone you love. Of course, it's painful. And to a degree that we let ourselves not remember that their life also has a lot of meaning, and that the grief is part of the joy we had with them. And that's right, not just that their life is over, but that there's a quality that's going to be missing. And yet that quality, and when we remember as a quality and not just the person, then I think it's really supported then to think, oh, these are the qualities they have brought to my life, and it has enriched my life, or to other people's life, and it has enriched their lives. It's like I told you guys, right, a few weeks ago, someone I know who's been working in the house here died a very violent death. And it was a big blow, right? And then the best friend, who was also one of the workers, was here recently to look at a housing thing. And for the first time I've seen him since his friend died. And, you know, there was tears, and there was certainly when we talked about that person. And then he also said, oh, you know, oh, and when I look at this railing, or when I drive around and I say, oh, we, meaning he and the friend that died, we did that job. And that brings me happiness, right? To remember this is what we've done together, how we fixed that, how we painted that, how we made, you know, something, a structure for plants to grow on. So when is it that we confine our lives by, on a certain level, not appreciating the relative? Because we do live in the relative. We can't escape. This mind, this heart, this body, essentially how we've been evoluted this mind, in a way, only thinks. In the thinking is the relative. In the formation of how we perceive is relative. However, our sense is vaster than the meaning we give to it, if that makes sense to you. So in a way, perhaps what we're saying is, or perhaps what I'm saying is, ironically, when we remember that the relative is part, or how we relate to the relativeness of our lives, determines whether we understand or whether we can sense the absoluteness of life. Shall I say that again? How we maybe an important thing to hold as you go through our daily lives is that that everything that we see, hear, touch, taste, think of, what am I missing? Ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Our experience of it is relative, and how we relate to the relativity of our life contains our ability to know the absolute. Because really, we're already in the absolute. Yet, to pinpoint it, when I say, okay, well, let go of all the whole day and just be here now, probably many of you think, oh, let's just be in the absolute. But really, I'm just saying, okay, be relative, but be completely relative. That's the irony of it, isn't it? Is that when we really appreciate the relative, then we absolutely understand how important, how lovely, how beautiful, how precious, maybe that's the best word, how precious this moment of relativity is. The hard part, of course, is then we say, oh, let's make sure the next one is just as good or better. Or we go, oh, it wasn't as good as that last one, right? When I went to hit the bell 3 times, first one was too soft. That's just the mind going. I didn't go, oh, lovely, quiet ring. No, my mind, the next, well, too soft. I did not appreciate the preciousness of that soft ring. Because really, is there any difference? We have been conditioned that that's a nice sound, most of us. Relatively together, we have decided that's an absolute ringing of a bell. That this is not a ringing of a bell, but that's a ringing of a bell. Maybe next week I'll just, and you guys will be like, oh, I want the preciousness of this relative bell. No, that'd be torture. That'd be the intentional torture. All right, I meant this tonight to be very specific here, and I've taken off as usual, or not as usual, but as time, as a relative of tonight has been, as relative it is. All right, the third holy truth, by the way, that means the third noble truth, right? The holy truths are the four noble truths, is about relative well-being, which is impermanent. Your toothache is impermanent, but your non-toothache is also impermanent. When you practice deep Buddhism, you remove all these notions and touch the world of no birth and no death. With that insight, you look at birth, death, old age, up and down, suffering and happiness with the eyes of a sage, and you don't suffer anymore. You smile, no longer afraid. So maybe the way to end suffering that he's saying here is when we remember that this pain that I'm having is interrelated. I'm thinking about the cow and the yogurt. Right? It's interrelated. There's a series to how this pain comes. What's the second one? Non-self. This pain is also made up of things are not about me and the pain. But you know, right now you might be going, what the hell is she talking about? But it could be like if I notice that I'm suffering as a pain because I'm cold, then temperature is the non-self of my suffering, of coldness. And third is that everything has a life, right? I'm only deciding that it's cold in here because that's a me sense. The temperature has its own life. Some of you here, you know, if you're having a hot flash, oh my God, remind me. When I said Tassajara, those have been Tassajara. The Zendo has soji screens, which literally only has paper on it. So in the winter, right, it's pretty cold in there. And one time I'm sitting in my seat in the winter in the practice period. I'm in the middle. A is on the left, B is on the right, and we're facing the wall. And the soji screen works, they're rectangle. You know, they take up, let's say they take up this much space and it's cut in half. So when you open one, right, this whole thing's open and then you close it. I'm sitting in the middle. Left person opens the soji screen. In the winter, it's cold. Then a few minutes, right person closes the window. Open, close. Talk about relative hell. I'm negotiating between their relativity, right? One was having a hot flash and needed more coldness. The other one was not having a hot flash and needed it, right? So this is like our sense of how things should be is relative to the condition as it is. And we can suffer or make others suffer when we forget that from this self is my experience, say, of hot or cold. And it's conditioned upon other things, how much clothes I have on, whether I'm having a hot flash or not, how much hair, right? Just a little bit when I shave for the first day, oh, it seems so much colder, right? So a lot of relativeness to it. So perhaps when we remember that what we hold to be true as our experience is really very relative, that helps us not to suffer so much. Because I know I suffer the most when I'm convinced that my relative should be, by that I mean my definition of things, should be your definition and your experience also. That's probably the biggest fight of partners or housemates or whatever, when you're saying, it's my truth. You better understand my truth. Or better yet, you better do my truth, right? Maybe not. Maybe you guys are much more advanced than I am. All right, the fourth noble truth is the cessation of the causes of suffering. When we put an end to our suffering, we feel relative joy. But when all of our concepts of suffering and not suffering cease, we taste absolute joy. Imagine two hens about to be slaughtered. But they do not know it. One hen says to the other, "The rice is much tastier than the corn." The corn is slightly off. She is talking about relative joy. She does not realize that the real joy of this moment is the joy of not being slaughtered, the joy of being alive. Yes, we can get stuck in the relative. It sounds a lot like the story I just said about the screen. All right. All right, so let's read the next, someone else besides me. Read the next couple of paragraphs here. When we practice the Four Holy Truths. Who would like to?
When we practice the Four Holy Truths in the dimension of relative truth, we obtain some relief. We are able to transform our suffering and restore our well-being. But we are still in the historical dimension of reality. The deeper level of practice is to lead our daily life in a way that we touch both the absolute and the relative truth. In the dimension of relative truth, the Buddha passed away many years ago, but in the realm of absolute truth, we can take his hand and join him for walking meditation every day. Practice in a way that gives you the greatest relief. The wave is already water. To enter the heart of the Buddha, use your Buddha eyes, which means your insight into interbeing. Approach the heart of Buddha in the realm of absolute truth, and the Buddha will be there with you. When you hear the sound of the bell, listen with your ears, and also listen with the ears of your ancestors, your children, and their children. Listen in the relative and absolute dimensions at the same time. You don't have to die to enter nirvana or the kingdom of God. You only have to dwell deeply in the present moment right now.
All right. All right, let's see. I had another paragraph that I thought was useful to read. Yeah, let's go back to the second page, 122, to the paragraph that says, "We enter the path of practice." I'd like to read that one, just that paragraph. Hey, Ben.
We enter the path of practice through the door of knowledge, perhaps from a Dharma talk or a book. We continue along the path and our suffering lessens little by little, but at some point, all of our concepts and ideas must yield to our actual experience. Words and ideas are only useful if they are put into practice. When we stop discussing things and begin to realize the teachings in our own life, a moment comes when we realize our life is the path. Now we no longer rely merely on the forms of practice. Our action becomes non-action and our practice becomes non-practice. The boundary has been crossed, and our practice cannot be set back. We do not have to transcend the world of dust in order to go to some dust-free world called nirvana. Suffering and nirvana are of the same substance. If we throw away the world of dust, we will have no nirvana.
All right. All right. Thank you very much.